You know, Rebels, if you've been checking out some of my promotional ads on social media, you will be aware that I have been using a lot of AI programs to help me create ads. But you know what? There's a lot more uses for AI than just funny little videos. And I'd like to introduce one of our new sponsors, Podium. It is a leader in creating AI tools for podcasters. Now, let's say you've got a podcast, or maybe you're even thinking of doing a podcast. You're probably wondering, well, how can AI be integrated with your workflow? I'll tell you about Podium. As a podcaster, you know that writing show notes and creating chapters and transcribing episodes takes a lot of time, and it can cost you a lot of money too. But you know what? That's where Podium comes in. It's an AI tool designed specifically for creators and podcasters with the goal of making post-production tasks quick and easy. And in just a few minutes, Podium generates show notes, chapters, summaries, clips for social media, a full transcript, suggested episode titles, social media posts, and more. Whew, that's a lot of work for one little program. Your show notes are key to your podcast's success because it helps new listeners find your podcast and they'll know if it's a fit for them. You know, kind of like Too Many Podcasts. It also improves your SEO, that's your search engine optimization. Ooh, big phrase there. And overall accessibility. And with Podium, you can focus on creating a great podcast and let Podium's AI do the heavy lifting. But Podium isn't just for solo creators and podcasters. It's a game changer for editors, producers, marketers, agencies, and production studios. Teams that use Podiums are able to increase workloads, decrease turnaround times, and improve their quality. How does it work? Very easy. First, go to Podium's website, and you'll see that link that's right there in the show notes. You get 3 hours free just to try it. Pretty cool, huh? And using that link also supports this show as well. And you know what else happens? Because I'm a good guy. You use my link, you will get 50% off for your first month. So visit the site, upload an MP3 file, and download your files, and that's it. And if you need anything else, you can use Podium GPT to generate articles and any marketing copy you might need in seconds. Instant show notes, transcripts, chapters for your podcast or channel. This will level up that podcast. So check out Podium today.
Too Many Podcasts is brought to you in cooperation with the SJ Network. If you are a person who would like to appear on podcasts, contact Stephen Joyner at s-j-network.com. We now direct you to the Sherpa Chalet, where we will turn it over to Jim the Podcast Sherpa. How he got this job is anyone's guess.
It's the Season 12 wrap-up for Too Many Podcasts. In this episode, we'd like to acknowledge everyone for being part of the show, along with Sherpa Samples and an announcement about the future of the podcast. Rumor has it that Jim the Podcast Sherpa will be replaced as host by Ryan Reynolds. Not Ryan Reynolds the actor, but Ryan Reynolds the top thumbtack salesman on Mount Podcastia. Fingers crossed.
Welcome to Too Many Podcasts, the podcast about podcasts. Now, podcasting from the Sherpa Chalet on Mount Podcastia, here's your host, Jim the Podcast Sherpa.
Hello there, Rebels of the Sherpa-lution, and welcome to Too Many Podcasts. It is the podcast about podcasts and so much more. I don't know. Jim the Podcast Sherpa coming to you from Sherpa-lu Studios in the Sherpa Chalet high atop Mount Podcastia, where I get to look out upon the hills and valleys of podcasts which surround us all everywhere. And because you're hearing my voice and not another person in the studio just yet, that must mean one thing. It's the Season 12 wrap-up. It's when I do a little mini episode and say thanks to everybody, pay tribute to the guests, and we do some Sherpa Samples. And today we've even got some news to let you know about that we will be getting to in a little while. But first, you know what we have to do. We have to say thank you. And who do I always thank first? You, the listeners. I appreciate you guys looking for me on your podcast apps or on the Sherpa-lution YouTube page and checking out the show. And hopefully, if you can, just kind of spread the word around to your friends and we can get even more people to listen. But we'll get to something exciting about that later on, too. It kind of ties in with the news that I have to let you know. Also, thanks so much to Publicist Extraordinaire. Steve Joyner for sending me a whole bunch of guests this season, and of course for Lord Mr. Bruce, who actually made a return appearance this season, and of course for his handiwork, and I actually may be needing his services very shortly. Lord Mr. Bruce, be ready. Be on the ready. I will be ringing the bell, sir. I'll be sending out the Sherpa signal. I don't know. But let's talk a little bit about the guests that we've had this season. I know I usually kind of talk about the podcasters, and then I don't really mention the folks who are on the Sherpa screening room. I did so many episodes because we did a lot of Sherpa Selects, bringing back some of the old episodes this season on Saturdays, if you ever want to check them out. Still there, still happening. Let's talk about this season. So we kicked things off with Ian Firmaglitch, and he was from the podcast Ian Talks Comedy. And of course, talking about people coming back, my buddy Mike Spedden, who was from Foul Players Radio, and we got to hang out and talk about his radio show. It's always fun talking with Mike. He's a super nice guy. And one of my new friends, Mr. Jordan Runtag, who hosts the podcast Too Much Information with his buddy Alex Heigl. And Jordan is also the producer of a podcast with Paul Anka and Skip Brunson called Our Way. And it's a really interesting podcast. You guys should check it out. They talk to a lot of interesting guests on that show. And as I mentioned, of course, Lord Mr. Bruce came back for the two-parter because there's just always so much ground we have to cover with my buddy. We also got to talk to Barks McGregor of Crossman Productions and author Jonathan Rosen as well. And of course, another return guest, Deanne Gustafson. She was Deanne Goodman originally, but she was a lady who was on the news, and now she's a Amazon influencer. Really cool lady. I like working with her. She's a lot of fun. We got to meet Julie Marty Pearson of the Story of My Pet podcast, Steve Fisher of Life Slices with Steve Fisher, Anna of the GBBA, which is Great Body by Anna podcast, a podcast about physical and mental health. And my buddy Greg Joseph, who we can't forget about him. He is the host of the Mean Machine radio show, and he's really done a lot for me on Twitter. I really appreciate that. Thank you, Mr. Greg. And on the music side, we got to talk to Okori Cello Johnson, and we got to hear some of his music, as well as a guy named Autonix, who does some really cool stuff as well. And of course, we had to get to talking about science a little bit, and we got to meet an actual NASA scientist, Dr. Tanya Rogers, and more new friends, Charles and Doug, and they are from the Seeing Them Live podcast, and that is a podcast about people sharing their live concert experiences. And we got to talk to Graveyard of the Mostly Pod Out at Night, mostly, and actually his buddy Young Phil from Distance Nerding. Those guys actually co-hosted a podcast together. We got to talk to screenwriter Ryan Cullen, author Tom Lasante, and also, in our finale, producer Mr. Mark Barron, my new friend on Facebook. Hey, Mark, thanks for helping wrap it up this season. So I thank all of you for being on the show, and maybe we will meet again on here. I don't know. We'll find out, I guess. I know some of them said if they have other projects, they'd like to pop back on the show. And that's great. And of course, thank you to the people who were on the original episodes that were brought back on the Sherpa Selects, which, as I mentioned before, you can see on Saturday. So with all those thank yous, I think it's time for Sherpa Samples.
Now it's time for Sherpa Samples. If you've got a podcast you'd like us to sample, contact us and we'll mention your name on the show.
And of course, we can't get through a show without having a little bit of Sherpa Samples. And I checked out some podcasts for you that are kind of interesting this week. We're kind of all over the map with this one, but maybe you can help me out. Okay, first I heard the Shizzy Lit Podcast. Now, I didn't know who Shizzy Lit was, but I think it's actually hosted by a guy named Shizzy Brizzle, and I still don't know who Shizzy Brizzle is, but I guess he must be popular because he's my podcast, right? And he must be well known because he's the OG Shizzy Brizzle. So, and I guess he was discussing hip-hop stuff. There's a lot of hip-hop slang in there, so if you don't know hip-hop slang, you'll be kind of lost. It's kind of like why I don't listen to a lot of the German podcasts. Not that I have anything against Germans, it's just that I just don't speak German. So if you want to get your news, you can go there. And The Headlines is a podcast by the New York Times. If you are a fan of them, they're brief discussions of the daily events in the world and in the nation. Very well done. If you'd like to get your news from there, or of course, you could always go back to Shizzy Lizzle. Gizzy, Shizzle, Shizzy Brizzle. Okay, we're going to move on. There's a couple of history podcasts I checked out. This is History, a Dynasty to Die For, focuses on ancient British history, and the episode that I checked out had to do with the early days of King Edward I. Another history podcast that I checked out was called Forbidden History, and this was about the Bermuda Triangle and the theories of what's going on down there. There were definitely a lot of conspiracy theories and other sorts of interesting thoughts about what's really happening. We really didn't get a specific answer, but it definitely raised a lot of very unusual points. I'll say that much. Embedded Tested is an NPR podcast, and that had to do with female athletes who were being tested, and they actually had high amounts of male hormones in them. Not that they were ingesting testosterone in them, it was just how they naturally were, and the discussion about how these women would be competing in female sports. And Idiot Abroad was actually produced several years ago. It's in cooperation with the Ricky Gervais show, and they sent a gentleman to China to actually experience Chinese culture, and I guess he met a kung fu master, and he went to the Great Wall of China and did all sorts of things like that. Ricky Gervais hasn't done a recent podcast, but it was on the charts, so hey, checking it out. A couple of crazy stories for you. Noble is not actually about nobility, but it's about a town in Georgia where in a crematorium, 300 bodies were found at the place, and the mystery behind why all those bodies were present there and not buried. You probably think this story is about you. I like this one. This was really interesting. It's told by a woman who met a gentleman, I guess, online, and, you know, the relationship that they had. And I only heard like a chapter of it, and it seemed that like that relationship was starting to unravel because all the stories that he told her seemed to differ when he was telling all the people that were close to her. I think it also actually becomes self-reflective on her part, you know, in regards to how she finds these relationships. But it probably goes into some detail about the gentleman who also deceived her as well. SNAFU with Ed Helms. This was a good one. Ed Helms is a pretty good podcaster. And this is a pretty cool story. I'd never heard about this. It had to do with an event back in the 70s, this season that I'm listening to. And during the Ali Frazier fight, some people broke into the FBI building in Philadelphia and stole a whole bunch of stuff. And then they went to the media as the committee to investigate the FBI. So it was a snafu on the part of the FBI. So what did they uncover? I guess you have to listen to the podcast to find out. Lastly, there's Where Everybody Knows Your Name, and it's actually not a Cheers rewatch podcast, but it does feature Ted Danson and Woody Harrelson, as they say, sometimes on the show. I guess he's in and out of there. And Ted Danson does a lot of interviews with his celebrity friends. And I heard an interview with the actress Lisa Kudrow, who is Phoebe on Friends, if some of you didn't know that already. He does a pretty good job as a podcaster. He's got a very soothing voice. I like that. I never even realized that all the time that I was watching Cheers. That's probably while I was watching him. He was probably relaxing me while he was serving up beer, even though I don't drink. And I never even got to yell normal that time. But I will yell outro because that's where we're heading.
Let's get back to the Sherpa.
Sorry about that.
So I'll tell you a little story. Back when I started this podcast, in 2019, I really did not have a name for it. I settled on Too Many Podcasts because I couldn't come up with anything better. And, you know, it's funny because when super publicist Steve Joyner would book guests on, the guests would think that it was such a funny name for a podcast, but I really wasn't trying to be funny. I was just really being honest. So, you know, that was the name that it was for all this time, which brings me to the announcement. When I did come up with the podcast and the name, I had this little Post-it that I kept in my wallet, just one little square from it. You guys know what I'm talking about, the little tiny pieces of paper with the sticky background. And whenever I got ideas for what I wanted to do with the show, I would write it down on this little Post-it. And mind you, I don't think anyone could have read it because I have such terrible handwriting. So it may as well have been in code. So this was really the seeds of this podcast. Which brings me to my announcement. So after 6 years and 320-something episodes, Too Many Podcasts will now be known as the Sherpa's Podcast Picks. The show itself really isn't going to change that much. We're still going to have interviews with podcasters. We're still going to do Sherpa Selects. Lord Mr. Bruce, I'm sure, will still be around. We're still doing the Sherpa screening room. So all of that stuff that hopefully you've enjoyed all this time will be the same, but it's going to have a new name. There's going to be some new artwork. And hopefully people who were looking for podcasts will notice this title a little bit better and realize that, hey, this is a place where you can find out about all sorts of podcasts. That's really the reason behind this change. Yeah, I know. I'm really on top of it, having to take 6 years to change my mind about that. Real good job, Jim. Real good job. But that is essentially the news. What's going to happen is next week you will hear the trailer for the new podcast to make people aware of it. And then after that, that'll be it. It'll be the new name, and we will just gradually transition into all the new episodes. And hopefully there are some things that I would really like to try out. I really want to get that, post it back in my wallet and come up with some new ideas for the show. Because I noticed those episodes were the ones that were actually the most listened to by you guys, the rebels of the Sherpa-lution. So I definitely feel that I was probably onto something when I first did that. So I guess we can think of it as Too Many Podcasts 2.0, maybe Too Many Podcasts 2 Electric Boogaloo, Too Many Podcasts Pod Harder, Too Many Podcasts 2 The Podcast Strikes Back, something like that. I don't know. It's kind of going to be that. Hopefully you are still enjoying what you're hearing. Well, maybe not these jokes, but you know what I mean. And you'll come back and maybe you can do me a favor and help spread the word about the new title and the new look of the podcast. And I hope that you do enjoy it. And I'm really looking forward to interacting with a lot of you. The podcast shows, I really want to be about things that you can add to your podcast playlist. So if you just started listening to the show, hopefully you can share some of this information on your social media accounts too, to let people know that this is something that they can add to their podcast playlist. So I've got some things in the works, nothing definite yet. I'm not going to commit to anything yet on the mic, but we will see how everything works. Same show, new name, new artwork. That's it in a nutshell. Again, I appreciate all of you listening for all of this time. And next week, again, you will hear the trailer for the new podcast, and we will take it from there. I guess that's really all that I really wanted to talk about on this show. So I would like to say thank you so much for sticking with the show and checking it out. And I hope to see you and even more of you in the near future. And don't forget to interact with me on social media, Facebook and Instagram. And let me know what some of the podcasts are that you're listening to. I would love to find out about that. And if I have not sampled them in Sherpa Samples, I will gladly do that. So keep me posted, okay? Lord Mr. Bruce, I think it's time to head out of here for season 12, and we will see you guys next time. So until then, viva la Sherpa-lution.
Thanks for listening to Too Many Podcasts. Please disperse. You can go home now. I said you can go home now. Viva la Sherpa-lution. Viva la Sherpa-lution. Oh. Yo, come back now, you hear?